politics really as someone who worked in an NGO, running an NGO during the communist period in Poland, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia, building free institutions by giving away medical textbooks to doctors and to professionals, people working in the medical sector in those communist countries. And that was an extraordinary time to be there, and one was able to see the effects of totalitarianism, the absence of the private sector, the absence of civil society as we understand it. And so it's all interesting to be able to return to that, having had the kind of intellectual revolution which I think is underway, going on at the moment in this country. And let's just start then with the principles. What I take to be the principles of the big society, which really are twofold. One of them is the liberation and empowerment of free institutions. That is to say, all of those institutions that sit between us as individuals and the state. And then the second principle is the liberation and empowerment of the individual, conceived not purely as an economic automaton or, as it were, reductively as a commercial, as a consumer, but conceived in the richest possible way as a kind of bundle of potential and active energy. And it seems to me those two principles can be seen actually in British politics at the moment. The government doesn't talk much about big society now. It's very wisely decided to, as it were, put it on the back burner until policy is allowed to, as it were, generate results and outcomes. It sees what, I think it's come around to the view I've been advocating for a while, which is this is a 10 or 20-year project. It's not something you do in the course of a single parliament. And if it's done properly, it's a sea change in thinking, which translates itself into a sea change in the nature of society, the nature of the way people interact with each other. So what you have is a government then on the institutional side, which is radically empowering schools with Michael Gove's agenda for free schools and for academies. It's radically empowering local government through what you will see through the Localism Act. And on the individual side, it's empowering individuals through benefit reforms designed to get people away from reliance on benefits through the people premium. And in due course, I'm very hopeful through a really widespread program of national citizens service. So when you see things in these terms, it actually helps to make sense not merely of a few programs that the government's called big society programs based on philanthropy and volunteering sitting in the cabinet office, but the whole architecture of government policy starts to come, at least in my reading, into some form of focus. Now, I said I had I took slight issue with the question. This is not a process of building. To talk about building society is automatically to have committed yourself to what I call what I would think of as a rationalist or totalitarian dogma. So, with that slight emendation, it's as I said, it's a process of allowing things to happen. It's not an organic process. It's not about building in any mechanistic sense. And in particular, it's not about a conception of society or as an entity, as a project, or as it were, an enterprise, or as a collective. It's society is something. You should think of it as rather like a chemical, an atom. A molecule. You can't say in advance what the molecule is going to look like, but you can talk about the kinds of atoms and carbon bonds that are going to link the various elements together, and you can try and encourage those to bond in interesting ways. And that's what I think policy of the big society should be trying to do. You won't be able to specify in advance what it will look like, but you will be able to say it will be built up in the right way, and you may get very, very pleasantly surprised by the energy that's released by such a society created in that way. That's one thing. How do we then translate those principles into the international arena, take them overseas? Well, I think the first thing you have to do is to look at the nature of our own market system. And you may have seen that as well as writing on a big society, I also published a paper just before Christmas on the idea of crony capitalism, which is a key to certain currency. It's on my website if anyone's interested. And what that's designed to do is to remind us about two things. One is that capitalism, properly understood, real capitalism, as I would describe, is the greatest force of economic, not merely economic, but social and you might argue moral development that's ever been created. Why economic? Well, we know about that. If you want an example, look at the difference between North Korea and South Korea, the same country until 1952, and then North Korea now has income per head, I think it's 39 times as high as that of South Korea, 39 times as high as that of North Korea. So there's an enormous difference between the two. That's essentially a form of capitalism in action. That's economic. Why social? Because capitalism, properly constructed, properly considered, is about exchange, barter, markets, human interaction, building of free institutions. That's a very important social creation. Why moral? Because capitalism, properly considered, is also about thrift, hard work, energy, things that are just good for human beings and good for their moral development. The trouble is that we've been living in a period of what I call crony capitalism, of heavily financially dominated capitalism, which has had two effects. It has separated out business activity from the public good. Historically, going back 700 years, there would have been quite a tight link there. Companies were allowed to incorporate because the assumption was made that the employment created, the business activity created, was good for society. That's one thing. And the second reason is that business reward gets separated from business merit. So people make a lot of money just for being around at a certain place at a certain time, not actually because of the work they've done, because of the thrift, the energy, and the creativity they've shown. So, what does that mean when we look overseas? What we see overseas is we see countries which are also in the grip of different kinds of what I call deviant kinds of capitalism. You can go to Pakistan, you can go to Egypt, and you will see countries that are dominated by khaki capitalism. Khaki capitalism is a form of capitalism in which the armed forces have become such significant players in those countries that they've started not merely to become, as it were, social actors, but also significant economic actors in their own right. The Egyptian army controls, the Egyptian armed forces control a substantial portion of that country's GDP. That would be one example. So you can see those kinds of that kind of concerns about whether capitalism is occurring, transformed into other countries. You can also see places where capitalism is really starting to thrive, and of course the examples that people will know about with defects as well as advantages are of course in places like India and China. But I think Africa is the best example. I mean, Africa is a country that is a continent that was written off until 10, 15 years ago, and there's now extraordinary levels of human development occurring in many parts of Africa. Why? Well, actually, vast amounts of it because of mobile telephony. That's been extraordinary capitalist development. So what does that mean for, as it were, government and international policy? Well, the first thing is be real about what's going wrong when it goes wrong. I mean, it's perfectly clear if you look at some of these countries, you are seeing enormous amounts of pollution created because capitalism is being allowed to develop in a way that doesn't price in these externalities. Okay, that's a very, very important matter of domestic policy on which thought leadership can come from this country, and a certain kind of example through our influence on international institutions and through the EU. So internalizing externalities, that very, very kind of boring economic phrase, turns out, in my view, to international development to be absolutely vital. A second thought would be a continued pressure from this country against corruption. Now you might say, well, who are MPs to be lecturing anyone about corruption? And I think there's a certain amount of truth to that. But I'm pleased to say that this country regularly scores very near the top from Transparency International. Our political system, no matter how angry we may get about it, actually is extraordinarily clean. American friends of mine can never believe that the total amount of money any MP is allowed to spend on the final 4 weeks of their election is £12,000 the last election, $20,000. That's for everything. Staff, office, leaflets, advertising, £12,000. That's less than a 15-second slot on state TV in America. There is no money power in British politics. So that kind of transparency, that kind of drive against corruption, that notion of a certain kind of public service is a very important thing that we can give to the rest of the world, and continue to give to the rest of the world. And that goes with Britain's greatest contribution, apart from the English language, to the world's development, which is the rule of law, on which we should be completely unflinching, in my view. So those are three things that we can do to come straight out of the idea of the big society as it is. But there's a final one I want to leave you with also, which is this idea of social value. The notion that the value of enterprise isn't simply captured by its economic activity. Now, we know that because we see things like triple line, bottom line accounting. That's an interesting project, but it doesn't really capture the real point, which is that the kind of experimentation we're seeing now in domestic policy with things like mutuals and co-ops and employer-owned organizations are starting to lead to I think, an extraordinarily interesting sea change in the way British government regards value creation, social value creation, not merely economic value creation. Of course, these are things that the international development community has understood for many, many years. If you go around the world, you'll see NGOs helping to set up food co-ops and farm co-ops and all kinds of organizations like that. So maybe there's some things that we can continue to learn from the rest of the world, from our engagement in developing countries, the developing world, and bring those further back to this country. Thank you very much.